Okay, you've gone through and done blocks and learned, of course, that the most important things about blocks is making sure that your blocks make sense with the size of your grid, which is set by Shift right click, Object Snap Settings, Snap and Grid. You make sure that these are set the same. There are a lot of other snaps you can eventually use, but the fact that you want these to be the same, 0.5, 0.5, or 0.2, 0.2, and then you want to turn on F7 and F9 at the same time. F7, F9 off, and when I do that, I really can't do that in this program. I'm trying to do some extra stuff there. So turning that on, you can also realize there's a setting called limits, which kind of defines how far the grid goes. All right, it's the first thing. When you're making blocks, I would recommend that you make a great number of layers, not just layer 0, and you preface those layers with some particular preface. So for instance, ZB for just an extra Z layer, extra B for block, and then something else. And you'll see why this will be if you want to add a bunch of different points that you can control the independent layers, so you can grab the particular parts of the layer. You'll also might want additional layers, some that are 2D and some that are 3D. So we're going to just go through this right now to add a couple of odd snap points on a block. We're going to do that first by making a couple of layers. You can do that by saying layer, clicking on layer there. I'm going to make a new layer here, ZB underscore border. Make a new one, ZB underscore point snaps, ZB underscore point snaps 2. So we've got 3 different layers, and of course we have the layer 0, and then finally I'm going to add one additional layer, ZB 3D lines. Alright, so we've got a whole bunch of layers there. We can change the colors if we want. We'll just change the color of the 3D one to green. The border and everything else we'll leave as white. Now you're going to do that because you can independently control layers within a block. Next thing you're going to want to do if you're just making blocks is to tend to draft them in a square of 1 unit. So I'm just going to click here and say at 1, 1. And so if I make all of my all of my blocks in this kind of 1 unit pattern here, we want to make sure that that then pattern is on the layer ZB border, which you'll be able to then freeze. So you've got the layer on ZB border. I'm just going to put in a simple circle here, circle from shift right click, mid between 2 points, shift right click, the midpoint of that, shift right click, the midpoint of that, shift right click, the midpoint of that, and I'm going to put in a circle here, and then I'm going to put in some odd points here. That is on layer 0, and that's the one we're going to want to definitely come in. We're going to go ahead and draw a couple more lines to get rid of. L for line, shift right click from the endpoint here, shift right click the endpoint there. Same thing from the endpoint here to the endpoint there. Now, we've got these are just kind of put in there at one point. I am going to trim these lines out. Remember, trim, spacebar, click, 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 click. Let's say I wanted to get a snap point that was just there in the middle of that point. I can now change the layer to ZB point snaps. And I can add a point. And a point is a very unusual thing in AutoCAD. It is the only AutoCAD entity that you grab when you use something called node. I'll do it again. Point from the mid of that. So now we got 2 points on there. We can get rid of these 2 layers here. You can also control independently what happens with your points. And now we're going to go to ZB point snaps 2, and we're going to add 2 more points. Point from the mid point, point to the mid. All right. So what we have now is, in this, we have actually 3 layers. This one layer here is DB border, which we're going to very often freeze. We've got 2 different sets of point snaps. We have a circle that's on 0, and finally we're going to go ahead and put a 3D shape in here. And we'll do that, if you remember, by doing an extrude circle. The other one right there. We will do extrude, and we'll make that a little bit taller than usual. Extrude of maybe 2. Now that is a 3D entity, and it's on layer. If we list it, it's on layer ZB snap or point snaps 2, so we'd like to put that on layer. Change it to a layer called 3D lines. All right, all that said, the last thing that's very important and kind of really key when you're doing blocks is what your insertion point is. So my insertion point, I'm going to go ahead and put in there as well. I'll put that on layer, also on this layer here. And so I can go ahead and change my current layer back to ZB border. I'm going to put a point in the center of there, and that's on layer 0. The insertion point is one of the most key things about blocks. And the last thing we can do is we can learn to do something with text that's going to change inside a block, and that is to do an attribute. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we can go ahead and define a number of attributes in the order of sometimes 100 attributes with one simple shape. But that command is @def, attribute defined. You have all this kind of information here. You can give it a tag, for instance, block name. What is the block name? And then default this. So more or less justification is going to be middle left in this case, point 2, all kinds of different things you can do. We're going to specify on screen, we're going to put that attribute right at the midpoint of there, and you'll see that one probably should potentially be on a particular layer. For right now, I'll leave that one on layer 0 because we are going to want to see that, and we can control it independently. That said, we now do our command, which is -B for block. We're going to call that our learning block. We're going to do our insertion base point is the node. We want to make sure we know exactly what our insertion base point is. We're going to grab all of our objects, and then we're going to want to grab our attributes in the order we want them to be picked. And you see that goes out. Now, if we go ahead and bring on our grid, shift right click, our grid, object snap settings, our grid, snap and grid, and we're going to now set our grid to be 1 in this case because that was what our block was set to be, 1, 1. And our grid 1, 1. Hit OK here. And now eventually you'll see the last thing you want to be aware of when you're dealing with the grid is you can change the limits. It's a very archaic thing, but I'm going to make it 100 by 100. So more or less it's going to limit out how big the grid will work. Regen will also help to do that. And now if we go to a layer that we want to make in terms of our object or our schematic, schematic, schematic here, we'll make that to be blue. Okay, we're going to set that to be current. Now when we use the insert command, our thing block will come in and it'll drag around about its insert point. So insert learning block. It's going to ask us the name. What is the block name? First, hit OK. And you know it went to 0, 0 because I didn't tell it anything different. Once again, I'm going to now insert another block. I'm going to specify on screen, again, learning block. I'm going to browse, cancel. I only want the learning block. I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to look and see how it's jumping around to those blocks there. That. Final thing we can do, however, is we can turn F7, F9 on.